The jeep coughed, stalled and died, right in the middle of the road. Sergeant Miller swore, a short, sharp curse swallowed by the oppressive heat of the Sicilian countryside. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. Dust coated everything, a fine, gritty film that tasted like defeat. He glanced at Private Kowalski, slumped in the passenger seat, his face pale. "What now, Sarge?" Kowalski croaked, his voice hoarse. "Now, Kowalski, we figure out why this damn thing decided to take a dirt nap. Check the fuel line." Miller climbed out, the metal of the jeep scalding his hand. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of diesel, dry grass. And something else, something acrid and faintly metallic. Fear Kowalski, moving with the slowness of a man who'd seen too much, fumbled under the hood. "Fuel line's clear, Sarge. Maybe the carb." Miller rounded the front, kicking the tire in frustration. "Carb's new. We just got this crate patched up last week." He scanned the horizon. Rolling hills, olive groves shimmering in the heat, and the distant rumble of artillery. They were supposed to be miles behind the front lines, ferrying supplies to a forward operating base. Supposed to be safe. Sarge Kowalski's voice was barely a whisper. He was staring at something behind Miller. Miller spun, his hand instinctively reaching for his Colt 45. 3 men stood in the middle of the road, blocking their path. German soldiers. 2 were armed with rifles, their faces grim. The third, an officer, held a Luger pointed directly at Miller's chest. "Well, well," the officer sneered, his English surprisingly good. "Look what we have here. 2 lost lambs," he gestured with the Luger. "Drop your weapon, American." Miller hesitated. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and stranded. But something in the officer's eyes, a cold, calculating cruelty, made him resist. "We're just here to deliver supplies," he said, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The officer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Supplies, eh? For who? The dead?" He took a step closer. "Drop it or I'll drop you." Miller glanced at Kowalski, his face a mask of terror. He knew they were in a desperate situation. He slowly lowered his hand, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the 45. He let it fall to the ground with a soft thud. "Good," the officer said, his eyes gleaming. "Now both of you, hands on your heads." As they complied, Miller noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Behind the officer, concealed amongst the olive trees, he saw the faint glint of sunlight on metal. More Germans, an ambush. They weren't just lost. They were trapped. Suddenly, Kowalski screamed. The officer whirled around, his Luger jerking. But it was too late. Before he could react, a burst of machine gun fire erupted from the olive grove. The officer staggered, clutching his chest, and collapsed. The other 2 soldiers didn't even have time to raise their rifles. Miller and Kowalski dove for cover behind the jeep as bullets whizzed overhead. The air filled with the roar of the machine gun, a deafening, exhilarating sound. Then, above the chaos, Miller heard another sound, a distinct mechanical growl, the sound of another jeep. And then he saw it. Bursting out of the olive grove, a jeep painted in camouflage, a monstrous 50 caliber machine gun mounted on its back. The gunner, a young wiry soldier with a grin on his face, unleashed another devastating barrage. The remaining Germans scattered, disappearing back into the trees. The roar of the 50 caliber slowly died down, replaced by the sputtering idle of the approaching jeep. The gunner jumped out, his grin widening. "Need a hand, fellas?" he asked, his voice casual. Miller stared at the 50 caliber, his mind reeling. He'd heard rumors about these improvised weapon systems, jeeps rigged with heavy machine guns. He'd even heard that the generals had forbidden them, deeming them too reckless, too dangerous. "Who are you?" Miller asked, his voice thick with disbelief. The gunner shrugged. "Just a couple of guys trying to win a war. Name's Riley. This here's Johnson, our driver." He gestured to a lanky soldier behind the wheel who gave a curt nod. "But the 50 cal," Kowalski stammered. "I heard they were outlawed," Riley chuckled. "Let's just say some rules are meant to be bent, especially when they keep you alive." He pulled out a wrench. "Now let's get this jalopy of yours running. We got a war to fight." As Riley tinkered with the engine, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stumbled into something much bigger than a firefight with a German patrol. He'd stumbled into a secret that could change the course of the war, a secret that could get them all killed. He felt the metallic tang of fear return, stronger than before, coating his tongue. Chapter 2. "You understand, Sergeant? This never happened." Captain Reynolds' voice was low, gravelly, laced with a warning that vibrated in the small tent. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the pungent odor of stale coffee. A single flickering lantern cast long dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Miller sat ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on Reynolds. Reynolds, a man hardened by years of combat, his face etched with the lines of countless sleepless nights, was not someone to be trifled with. "Understood, Captain Riley and Johnson," Reynolds continued, tapping a thick file on his desk. "They're resourceful. They get results. But what they're doing, it's unorthodox. Generals don't like unorthodox. They saved our lives," Kowalski blurted out before catching himself. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Reynolds shot him a withering look. "Your life is not the military's concern, Private. Winning the war is, and sometimes winning requires certain compromises. The 50 caliber Jeeps are one of those compromises. Officially, they don't exist. Understand?" Miller nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. Deniability. If anything went wrong, the higher-ups could claim ignorance. He thought about Riley and Johnson, out there on their own, bending the rules to stay alive and kill Nazis. They were operating in the shadows, doing what needed to be done while the generals pretended not to see. "Why tell us this?" Miller asked. "Why not just send us on our way?" Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Because you saw them, and because your supply run is critical. We're running low on ammunition at the front. You'll be escorted to the forbade, and you'll deliver those supplies. You will not speak of Riley and Johnson. You will not mention the 50 caliber Jeep, is that clear?" "Crystal," Miller replied, his voice firm. He knew he had no choice. He was a soldier and he followed orders. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now a part of something bigger, something more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. After they left the tent, Kowalski's tension was palpable. "Sarge, what do we do? This feels wrong." Miller stopped, looking at Kowalski. "We do what we're told. We deliver the supplies and we keep our mouths shut. That's all we can do." He paused. "But if we see Riley and Johnson again?" "What?" Kowalski asked, his eyes wide. "We help them," Miller said, his voice low and resolute. "We help them any way we can." Later that night, under the cloak of darkness, Miller found a radio operator. He knew he was taking a risk, but he had to try. He had to warn someone. "This is Sergeant Miller," he whispered into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "Requesting contact with Yuan Jun. Do you copy?" "I repeat, requesting contact with Yuan Jun." Static crackled in his ear. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He repeated the message, his voice growing more desperate. Still only static. He was about to give up when he heard a faint voice crackle through the speaker. "Yuan Jun, copy, barely receiving you, Sergeant. What is your situation?" Miller took a deep breath. "I have information regarding unauthorized operations, vital to the war effort. They are bending the rules and their right to do so." He quickly outlined what he had witnessed. The voice on the other end was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again. "Understood, Sergeant. We will look into it. Remain silent for now, Yuan Jun." Out the radio went dead. Miller stared at the microphone, his mind racing. Had he done the right thing? Had he just put himself and Kowalski in even more danger? He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had to try to help. As he walked back to his tent, he noticed a shadow moving amongst the trees. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. The shadow stopped, and a figure stepped out into the moonlight. "It was Riley, Sarge," Riley said, his voice low. "Heard you were asking about Yuan Jun." He stepped closer, the moonlight glinting off the .45 slung across his chest. "You should be careful who you talk to. Some people don't like questions." He smiled, but there was no humor in his eyes. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he was in deep trouble. Chapter 3. Riley's smile vanished. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know what we do, Sarge. You know why we do it. But knowing isn't enough. You got to decide what you're gonna do about it." He spat on the ground. "You gonna be part of the problem or part of the solution?" Miller met his gaze, unflinching. "I helped you get my Jeep running. I didn't report you. What do you think?" Riley studied him for a long moment, his eyes searching. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, Sarge, I believe you, but belief ain't worth much in this war. Actions speak louder than words." He gestured towards the east. "We're heading towards Messina. Intel says the Germans are digging in deep. Anti-tank guns, artillery, a real meat grinder. That's where we're headed to, Kowalski spoke up, surprising both Riley and Miller. To resupply the 1st Infantry. We got ammo and medical supplies. Riley's eyes lit up. Ammo, huh? And medical supplies. That's interesting. He paused, tapping his chin. Tell you what, Sarge. We'll escort you to the front, provide some extra firepower. But you gotta promise me something. What's that? Miller asked, wary. You gotta turn a blind eye to what we do, Riley said, his voice hard. We operate outside the lines. We take risks. We might even break a few rules. If you can't handle that, walk away now. Miller looked at Kowalski, who nodded grimly. He knew what Riley was asking. He was asking them to become complicit. To become part of the secret we're in, Miller said, his voice firm. Riley grinned. Good. Welcome to the family, Sarge. He extended his hand. Miller shook it, sealing the bargain. The next morning, they set out for Messina. Miller and Kowalski in their battered jeep, followed by Riley and Johnson in their heavily armed machine. The journey was tense, filled with the constant threat of ambush. They passed through bombed-out villages, the air thick with the smell of death and decay. They saw the faces of the refugees, hollow-eyed and haunted, their lives shattered by the war. This is hell, Kowalski whispered, his voice barely audible. It's war, Miller replied, his voice grim, and it's only going to get worse. As they approached the front lines, the sound of artillery grew louder, a constant, deafening roar. They saw the smoke rising in the distance, black plumes against the clear blue sky. Suddenly a shell landed nearby, sending a shower of dirt and debris into the air. The jeep swerved, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Incoming! Riley yelled over the radio. Get down! They pulled over to the side of the road, taking cover behind a shattered stone wall. Shells continued to rain down around them, each explosion shaking the ground. We gotta move! Miller shouted. We're sitting ducks here. Riley revved his engine. Follow me! I know a shortcut. He sped off down a narrow dirt track, weaving through the olive groves. Miller hesitated for a moment, then followed. The track led them into a steep ravine, offering some protection from the artillery fire. But it was also a dangerous route, filled with hidden obstacles and potential ambushes. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, they came across a roadblock. German soldiers had set up a machine gun nest, blocking the path. We're pinned down, Kowalski yelled. Riley didn't hesitate. He slammed on the gas, charging straight towards the roadblock. Johnson opened fire with the .50 caliber, unleashing a devastating barrage of bullets. The German soldiers scattered, trying to find cover. Miller grabbed his rifle and joined the fight, firing at the enemy positions. Kowalski reloaded magazines, feeding them to Miller as fast as he could. The battle was short and brutal. The .50 caliber chewed through the German defenses, tearing apart the machine gun nest and silencing the enemy. In a matter of minutes, the roadblock was cleared. But at a cost. Johnson had been hit by a stray bullet. He slumped over the wheel, his eyes glazed over. Riley jumped out of the jeep, rushing to Johnson's side. Johnson, can you hear me? Johnson coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. Riley, I don't think I'm going to make it. Riley's face contorted with grief. Don't talk like that, Johnson. We're going to get you help. Johnson shook his head weakly. It's too late, Riley. You got to keep fighting for both of us. He took a final breath and went still. Riley stared at his dead friend, his eyes filled with rage. Damn it, he roared, pounding his fist on the jeep. Damn it all to hell. Miller approached Riley, his face grim. I'm sorry, Riley, he said softly. He was a good soldier. Riley didn't respond. He just stared at Johnson's lifeless body, his heart filled with a burning desire for revenge. We can't stay here, Miller said. We gotta move. The Germans will be back. Riley nodded slowly. He climbed back into the jeep, his face a mask of cold determination. Let's go, he said, his voice flat. Let's go kill some Nazis. And Chapter 4, the stench of death clung to them like a shroud. They left Johnson's body behind, a temporary grave marked with a hastily fashioned cross. Riley drove in a furious silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The .50 caliber, usually a symbol of defiant power, now seemed like a mournful monument to their loss. They reached the forward operating base, FOB, just as the sun began to set. The scene was chaotic. Wounded soldiers lay on makeshift stretchers, moaning in pain. Medical personnel rushed back and forth, their faces grim. The air was filled with the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and the desperate cries of men. "This is it," Miller said to Kowalski, his voice tight. "This is what we came here for." They unloaded the supplies, stacking them neatly in a designated area. As they worked, Miller noticed a group of officers huddled together, arguing heatedly. One of them, a stern-faced colonel with a thick mustache, caught Miller's eye and beckoned him over. "You're the supply sergeant, right?" the colonel barked. "Yes, sir," Miller replied, standing at attention. "We're running critically low on morphine," the colonel said. "The wounded are suffering. Do you have any morphine in your shipment?" Miller's heart sank. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "We were promised a shipment, but it never arrived. We only have a few first aid kits." The colonel's face darkened. "Damn it, this is a disaster. We need that morphine, and we need it now." He turned to one of the other officers. "Contact headquarters. Tell them we need immediate resupply." As the officers continued their discussion, Miller saw Riley standing nearby, listening intently. He could see the wheels turning in Riley's head. After the officers dispersed, Riley approached Miller. "Morphine, huh?" he said, his voice low. "That's a valuable commodity." "We need it badly," Miller replied. "Soldiers are dying without it." Riley paused, stroking his chin. "I might know where we can get some morphine," he said. "But it's going to be risky." "How risky?" Miller asked, his eyebrows raised. "We're going to have to go behind enemy lines," Riley said. "There's a German field hospital a few miles from here. They're bound to have a supply of morphine." Miller stared at Riley, his mind racing. Going behind enemy lines was suicide. But the thought of the wounded soldiers suffering without morphine, he couldn't ignore it. "I'm in," Miller said. "But Kowalski stays here." "He's had enough." Riley nodded. "Fair enough. Let's get moving." They slipped out of the fob under the cover of darkness, heading towards the German lines. Riley drove the jeep, his eyes scanning the horizon. Miller sat beside him, clutching his rifle, his nerves on edge. As they approached the German lines, they heard the sound of voices. A group of German soldiers were patrolling the area. "We gotta be careful," Riley whispered. "We don't want to get caught." They pulled over to the side of the road, cutting the engine. They waited in silence, listening to the German soldiers as they passed by. Once the soldiers were gone, they continued on their way, driving slowly and cautiously. They eventually reached the German field hospital, a cluster of tents and vehicles nestled in a small valley. "All right," Riley whispered. "Here's the plan. I'll create a diversion. You sneak into the hospital and find the morphine." "Got it?" Miller nodded. "Got it, but be careful," Riley grinned. "When am I not?" He revved the engine and sped towards the hospital, firing the .50 caliber into the air. The German soldiers scrambled for cover, their attention focused on Riley's attack. Miller took advantage of the distraction, slipping into the hospital grounds. The scene inside was even more chaotic than at the American fob. Wounded German soldiers lay everywhere, groaning in pain. Doctors and nurses rushed around, trying to treat the injured. Miller moved quickly and quietly, searching for the morphine supply. He checked every tent, every room, but he couldn't find it. Just when he was about to give up, he spotted a small wooden crate tucked away in a corner. He opened it, and his heart leaped with joy. It was filled with vials of morphine. He grabbed as many vials as he could carry and stuffed them into his pockets. As he turned to leave, he bumped into a German nurse. The nurse screamed, alerting the other personnel. Miller knew he was caught. He had to get out of there, and fast. He bolted towards the exit, dodging the German soldiers who were trying to stop him. He made it back to the jeep where Riley was waiting, his face covered in soot. "Get in," Riley yelled. "We gotta go." Miller jumped into the jeep and Riley sped away, leaving the German field hospital in chaos. They drove as fast as they could, dodging bullets and explosions. They eventually made it back to the American lines, exhausted but triumphant. They had the morphine. But as Miller handed the vials to the colonel, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a line. They had stolen from the enemy. They had risked their lives for a supply of medicine. And they had done it all without orders, without permission. He looked at Riley, who was grinning from ear to ear. He knew that they were now bound together by a secret that could either save them or destroy them. He closed his eyes. The taste of fear was bitter on his tongue. Chapter 5. The morphine helped. The wounded men stopped screaming, their faces relaxing into a semblance of peace. The colonel, his face etched with exhaustion but also relief, clapped Miller on the shoulder. "You did good, Sergeant." Real good. But the feeling of unease lingered in Miller's gut. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of guilt and fear. He found Kowalski sitting on a crate, staring blankly at the ground. "What's wrong?" Miller asked. Kowalski looked up, his eyes haunted. "I saw them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The German wounded. They were just like us, scared, hurt, dying." Miller knew what he meant. War stripped away the uniforms, the flags, the propaganda, leaving only the raw, brutal reality of human suffering. "We did what we had to do," Miller said, trying to sound convincing. "We saved our own men, but at what cost?" Kowalski asked. "What kind of men are we becoming?" Miller didn't have an answer. He just stood there in silence, the weight of the war crushing down on him. Later that evening, Riley approached Miller. "I heard you got the morphine to the colonel," he said. "Good job." "It doesn't feel like a good job," Miller replied, his voice flat. Riley shrugged. "War ain't supposed to feel good. It's supposed to be won." He paused, his eyes hardening. "We got a new problem. Intel says the Germans are planning a counterattack. They're gonna hit us hard, and they're gonna hit us soon." "How do you know this?" Miller asked, his suspicions rising. "I got my sources," Riley said, his voice evasive. "The point is, we need to be ready. We need to find out where they're gonna attack, and we need to stop them." "How do you propose we do that?" Miller asked. Riley grinned. "We're gonna go for a little reconnaissance mission. We're gonna sneak behind enemy lines and find out what they're planning." Miller stared at Riley, his mind reeling. He had just risked his life stealing morphine from the Germans, and now Riley wanted him to go back behind enemy lines again. He was pushing his luck. "I don't know, Riley," Miller said. "This is getting too dangerous. We're gonna get ourselves killed." "Maybe," Riley said. "But if we don't do this, a lot more soldiers are gonna get killed. It's your call, Sarge. You want to sit here and wait for the Germans to attack, or do you want to do something about it?" Miller knew he couldn't back down. He couldn't let fear control him. He had to do what he believed was right, even if it meant risking his life. "All right," Miller said. "I'm in." "But this is the last time, Riley. I can't keep doing this." Riley nodded. "Fair enough. Let's get moving." They set out under the cover of darkness, heading towards the German lines once again. This time they were even more cautious, moving slowly and quietly, avoiding the patrols. As they ventured deeper into enemy territory, they came across a small farmhouse. Riley stopped the jeep. "This place looks deserted," he said. "Let's check it out. Maybe we can find some intel." They approached the farmhouse cautiously, their weapons drawn. They kicked down the door and stormed inside. The house was empty, but it was clear that it had been recently occupied. There were dirty dishes on the table, clothes scattered on the floor, and maps pinned to the wall. Miller examined the maps closely. They showed the American positions, marked with troop movements and artillery placements. The Germans knew everything. "They've got inside information," Miller said, his voice grim. "They know our every move," Riley nodded. "We got to find out who's feeding them this information. There's a traitor in our ranks." Just then they heard the sound of approaching vehicles. "German soldiers were coming. We got to get out of here," Riley yelled. They raced back to the jeep and sped away, the German soldiers in hot pursuit. Bullets whizzed overhead as they navigated the dark and winding roads. They eventually managed to shake off the Germans, but they knew they were in serious trouble. They had stumbled upon a conspiracy, a web of deceit and betrayal that threatened to undermine the entire war effort. As they drove back to the American lines, Miller felt a growing sense of dread. He knew that they were in way over their heads. He closed his eyes and tasted dust and ashes on his tongue. Chapter 6. Back at the FOB, Miller and Riley sought out Captain Reynolds. They found him hunched over a map table, his face illuminated by a single lantern. He looked up, his eyes weary. "What is it, Sergeant?" Reynolds asked, his voice strained. Miller laid out the stolen German maps on the table. "We found these at a farmhouse behind enemy lines, Captain. They show our positions, our troop movements, everything. The Germans have inside information." Reynolds examined the maps closely, his face growing increasingly grim. "This is serious," he said. "If the Germans know our every move, we're doomed." "We think there's a traitor in our ranks, Captain," Riley added. "Someone who's feeding them information." Reynolds slammed his fist on the table. "Damn it! This is the last thing we need. We're already stretched thin as it is." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "How did you get these maps, Sergeant?" Miller hesitated. He knew he couldn't tell Reynolds the truth. He couldn't reveal their unauthorized reconnaissance mission or their theft of the morphine. He had to lie. We found them on a dead German soldier, Miller said, his voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was carrying them. Reynolds studied Miller for a long moment, his eyes searching. Miller held his gaze, trying to appear innocent. Finally, Reynolds nodded slowly. "All right, Sergeant. I'll take your word for it. But I want you to find this traitor. I want you to find him, and I want you to bring him to me." "Understand?" "Yes, sir," Miller replied. Reynolds turned to Riley. "And you, I don't know what you're doing out there, but I want you to stay out of trouble. Do you hear me?" "This is a direct order," Riley shrugged. "Yes, sir." As they left the tent, Miller turned to Riley. "What do we do now?" he asked. Riley grinned. "Now we go hunting. We find this traitor and we make him pay." They started by questioning the soldiers at the fob. They asked about anyone who seemed suspicious, anyone who might have had contact with the Germans. But they came up empty. "Everyone seems loyal," Kowalski said, his voice discouraged. "I don't think we're going to find anything." "Don't give up yet," Riley said. "There's got to be someone. We just got to dig deeper." They decided to focus on the officers, the men who had access to the most sensitive information. They started by observing their behavior, looking for any signs of disloyalty. One officer in particular caught their attention. Lieutenant Davis was a young, ambitious man who had recently been promoted. He seemed eager to please, but he also seemed nervous and secretive. "He's hiding something," Riley said, his eyes narrowing. "I can feel it." They started following Davis, observing his movements, listening to his conversations. They discovered that he was making frequent trips to a nearby town, ostensibly to gather intelligence. "Let's follow him," Miller said. "See what he's up to." They followed Davis to the town, keeping a safe distance. They watched as he entered a small cafe. Riley grinned. "This is going to be interesting." They parked the jeep down the street and waited. After an hour, Davis emerged from the cafe, accompanied by a German officer. Miller and Riley exchanged a look. They had their traitor. They confronted Davis, their weapons drawn. Davis looked shocked and terrified. "What's going on?" he stammered. "What do you want?" "We know you're a traitor, Davis," Miller said, his voice hard. "We know you're feeding information to the Germans." Davis denied the accusations, but Miller and Riley didn't believe him. They forced him into the jeep and drove him back to the phobby. They took Davis to Captain Reynolds, who was waiting for them. Reynolds questioned Davis, but Davis refused to confess. "He's lying," Riley said. "I can see it in his eyes." Reynolds sighed. "I don't have time for this," he said. "We need proof," Riley grinned. "I know how we can get proof." He grabbed Davis and dragged him out of the tent. Miller and Kowalski followed, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew what Riley was planning to do. He was going to torture Davis. Riley took Davis to a secluded area behind the tents. He tied him to a tree and began to beat him. Miller watched in horror, his stomach churning. He knew that torture was wrong, but he also knew that they needed to find out the truth. "Tell us," Riley yelled, his voice filled with rage. "Tell us who you're working with." Davis screamed in pain, but he still refused to confess. Miller couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, grabbing Riley's arm. "Stop," Miller said. "This isn't right. We can't do this." Riley stared at Miller, his eyes filled with fury. "He's a traitor, Miller. He's helping the Germans kill our men." "I know," Miller said, "but we can't stoop to their level. We can't become monsters." Riley hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his fist. He stepped back, his chest heaving. "All right," Riley said, his voice strained. "You're right. This isn't the way," he spat on the ground. "But we still need to find out the truth." As Riley untied Davis, Kowalski noticed something glinting in the grass nearby. He picked it up. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opened it and his eyes widened. "Look at this," Kowalski said, his voice trembling. Inside the box was a stack of photographs. Photographs of Captain Reynolds meeting with German officers. Photographs of Reynolds handing over documents. Photographs of Reynolds receiving money. Miller and Riley stared at the photographs in disbelief. They had found the traitor. But it wasn't Davis, it was Reynolds. Chapter 7. The silence that followed Kowalski's discovery was thick and suffocating. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, heavier than any artillery barrage. Disbelief warred with a creeping certainty. The man they trusted, the man who gave the orders, was the enemy. Riley was the first to break the silence. He snatched the box from Kowalski, his eyes blazing with fury. "That son of a bitch," he roared. I knew there was something wrong with him. Miller, however, remained strangely calm. The shock had numbed him, leaving him with a cold, detached sense of clarity. He had suspected something was amiss, but he had never imagined the betrayal would reach so high. "We have to be careful," Miller said, his voice steady. "Reynolds is dangerous. He's got the entire camp under his control. We need to expose him," Kowalski stammered. "We need to tell someone." "Who?" Riley scoffed. "Who are we going to tell? He's got everyone in his pocket. If we go to anyone else, he'll know about it and he'll kill us." Miller thought for a moment. "There's one person we can trust," he said. "The radio operator. He helped me contact Yuanjun before. He's our only hope." They found the radio operator, a nervous young man named Peterson, huddled in his shack. Miller showed him the photographs. Peterson's face paled as he looked at them. This can't be true," Peterson stammered. "Captain Reynolds, he's a hero." "He's a traitor," Miller said, his voice firm. "We need you to contact Yuanjun." "We need to report this." Peterson hesitated, his hands trembling. I don't know if Reynolds finds out." "If we don't do this, a lot of good soldiers are going to die," Miller said. "Reynolds is feeding the Germans information. He's setting us up for a massacre." Peterson took a deep breath. "All right," he said. "I'll do it. But you have to promise me if anything goes wrong, you'll get me out of here." "We promise," Miller said. Peterson sat down at the radio and began to transmit. He sent a coded message to Yuanjun, reporting Reynolds' treachery and requesting immediate assistance. They waited anxiously for a response. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the radio and the pounding of their hearts. Finally, a faint voice crackled through the speaker. "Yuanjun, copy receiving request. Confirmed assistance on the way, standby for further instructions." They breathed a collective sigh of relief. Help was on the way, but their relief was short-lived. Just then, the door to the shack burst open, and Reynolds stormed inside, his face contorted with rage. "What's going on here?" Reynolds roared. "What are you doing?" Peterson froze, his face white with terror. Miller and Riley instinctively reached for their weapons. Reynolds advanced towards them, his eyes blazing. "I know what you've been up to," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can expose me? You think you can get away with this?" He pulled out his pistol and pointed it at Peterson. "You're all going to pay for this." Before Reynolds could fire, Riley lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men wrestled, struggling for control of the pistol. Miller joined the fight, kicking Reynolds in the ribs. Reynolds grunted in pain, but he refused to release his grip on the pistol. Suddenly the pistol went off. A bullet whizzed past Miller's head, narrowly missing him. Riley finally managed to disarm Reynolds, knocking the pistol out of his hand. He grabbed Reynolds by the throat and began to choke him.